The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval base as Lieutenant Sarah Martinez walked toward the supply depot. At 28, she had already earned respect among her peers for her quick thinking and steady nerves. The daughter of immigrants, Sarah had worked twice as hard to prove herself in the male-dominated military environment. Her black hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her uniform bore the crisp lines that spoke of discipline and pride. The base buzzed with its usual activity. Sailors moved between buildings, carrying out their daily duties. The sound of boots on concrete mixed with distant voices and the occasional roar of aircraft overhead. Sarah loved this environment. It gave her purpose and structure that had been missing from her civilian life. As she approached the depot, something felt different. The usual chatter from inside was replaced by an unsettling silence. The large metal door stood slightly ajar, which was unusual for this time of morning. Protocol demanded that all supply areas remain secured when not in active use. Sarah slowed her pace, her training kicking in automatically. She noticed that Petty Officer Johnson, who normally stood guard at the entrance, was nowhere to be seen. A cold feeling settled in her stomach. Johnson never abandoned his post without proper relief. Something was wrong, and every instinct she had developed during her years of service was telling her to be careful. Sarah reached for her radio to call for backup, but hesitated. What if she was overreacting? What if Johnson had simply stepped inside for a routine check? She didn't want to sound an alarm over nothing and face the embarrassment that might follow. Still, her gut told her that this situation was anything but routine. The depot held millions of dollars worth of equipment and supplies. It was a target that any enemy would find attractive. Recent intelligence reports had mentioned increased chatter about potential threats to military installations. Sarah had attended briefings where they discussed the possibility of insider threats and coordinated attacks. She decided to investigate further before calling for help. Moving closer to the door, she could hear muffled voices from inside. One voice was louder than the others, more aggressive. It didn't sound like normal conversation or work-related discussion. The tone was threatening, commanding. Sarah positioned herself near the door frame and listened carefully. She could make out at least 3 different voices. One belonged to Johnson, but he sounded distressed, frightened even. Another voice she didn't recognize at all. The third voice sent chills down her spine because of its cold, calculated tone. The unknown voice was giving orders, demanding something. Sarah caught fragments of conversation about access codes and security protocols. Her blood ran cold as she realized what was happening. This wasn't a routine supply check or a friendly conversation between colleagues. This was something far more dangerous. She knew she had to act quickly but carefully. The wrong move could escalate whatever was happening inside and put innocent lives at risk. Sarah had trained for situations like this, but training was different from reality. Real situations came with unpredictable variables and split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. Taking a deep breath, Sarah slowly moved to get a better view through the crack in the door. What she saw inside made her heart race and confirmed her worst fears. This was no ordinary day at the naval base, and the choices she made in the next few minutes would change everything. Through the narrow opening, Sarah could see Captain Reynolds standing in the center of the depot. But this wasn't the composed officer she knew from daily briefings. His face was red with anger, sweat beaded on his forehead, and his hands shook slightly as he gripped his service weapon. The gun was pointed directly at Petty Officer Johnson, who sat tied to a chair with his hands behind his back. Captain Reynolds had always been an intense man, but Sarah had never seen him like this. His usually perfect uniform was disheveled, his shirt untucked and his tie hung loose around his neck. His eyes had a wild look that suggested he was operating on pure adrenaline and desperation. Whatever had driven him to this point had pushed him far beyond normal thinking. Johnson's face was bruised and blood trickled from a cut above his left eye. His normal, confident demeanor was replaced by obvious fear as he stared at the weapon pointed at him. Despite his terror, Johnson maintained enough composure to avoid sudden movements that might trigger an even worse response from the captain. 2 other men stood near the back of the depot, both wearing civilian clothes that looked out of place on the military base. They were clearly not authorized personnel. One was tall and thin with dark hair, constantly checking his watch and glancing toward the exits. The other was shorter but more muscular, carrying what appeared to be a bag full of equipment. Both men looked nervous but determined. Sarah realized she was witnessing something far worse than she had initially imagined. This wasn't just an argument gone wrong or a personal dispute between military personnel. The presence of the civilians suggested a coordinated plan, possibly involving espionage or theft of classified materials. The depot contained sensitive equipment and documents that could be valuable to foreign governments or terrorist organizations. Captain Reynolds was speaking in a harsh whisper, demanding that Johnson provide access codes to secured areas of the base. Johnson kept shaking his head, either unable or unwilling to comply. Each refusal seemed to make Reynolds more agitated, and Sarah could see his finger tightening on the trigger. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Sarah knew that time was running out for Johnson, and possibly for others on the base if these men gained access to classified areas. She had to make a decision quickly, but her options were limited. Confronting 3 armed men alone would likely result in multiple casualties, including her own death. She carefully backed away from the door and reached for her radio. Keeping the volume low to avoid detection, Sarah needed to contact security immediately, but she also needed to provide them with accurate information about what they would be facing. The wrong approach could turn the situation into a bloodbath. As she prepared to make the call, Sarah heard Reynolds' voice grow louder and more threatening. He was giving Johnson a final ultimatum. The desperation in the captain's voice suggested that whatever plan was in motion had a strict timeline, and delays were not acceptable to his civilian partners. Sarah realized that help might not arrive in time to save Johnson's life. She was the only person who knew what was happening, and she might be the only one in position to prevent a tragedy. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders as she considered her limited options. The sound of footsteps approaching from outside made Sarah's blood freeze. Someone else was coming toward the depot, unaware of the danger waiting inside. If another unsuspecting sailor walked into this situation, it would only make things worse and give the conspirators more hostages to control. Sarah quickly moved to intercept whoever was approaching the depot. She spotted Seaman First Class Williams walking casually toward the building, carrying a clipboard and appearing focused on routine duties. Sarah had to stop him without alerting the men inside to her presence, or the fact that their situation had been discovered. Moving swiftly but quietly, Sarah caught up with Williams about 50 yards from the depot entrance. She grabbed his arm and pulled him behind a nearby building, placing her hand over his mouth before he could speak. Williams' eyes went wide with confusion and alarm, but Sarah's serious expression told him this was no joke. "Listen carefully," Sarah whispered urgently. "There are armed men holding Johnson hostage in the depot. Captain Reynolds is involved. I need you to get to security immediately and tell them we have a code red situation. Tell them we need tactical response, not just regular security. Do you understand?" Williams nodded quickly, his initial confusion replaced by the gravity of the situation. Sarah released him and watched as he ran toward the main security office. She knew he would deliver the message, but she also knew that response teams would need time to organize and position themselves properly, time that Johnson might not have. Returning to her position near the depot, Sarah could hear the conversation inside becoming more heated. Reynolds was shouting now, his voice cracking with stress and desperation. The civilian accomplices were arguing with him, clearly unhappy with how the situation was developing. Their plan was falling apart, and desperate people made dangerous decisions. Sarah heard Johnson cry out in pain, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Reynolds had apparently decided that physical intimidation might be more effective than threats. The violence was escalating, and Sarah knew that once it reached a certain point there would be no going back. She positioned herself where she could see through the door opening again. Johnson was now on the ground, still tied to the chair which had been knocked over. Blood flowed more freely from new injuries to his face. Reynolds stood over him, the gun now pressed against Johnson's temple while he screamed demands for the access codes. The 2 civilians were packing equipment into their bags more quickly now, suggesting they were preparing to leave regardless of whether they got what they came for. The tall one kept checking his phone, possibly communicating with someone outside the base. The muscular accomplice had produced his own weapon and was watching the entrances nervously. Sarah realized that the situation had reached a critical point. The conspirators were likely planning to eliminate Johnson to prevent him from identifying them later. Once they decided he was no longer useful, they would execute him and attempt to escape. Sarah couldn't wait for backup that might arrive too late. She began moving around the building, looking for alternative entrances or ways to get closer without being detected. The depot had several windows, but most were too high to reach without equipment. There was a service entrance on the far side, but it would require her to cross open ground where she might be spotted. As Sarah weighed her options, she heard vehicles approaching rapidly from the direction of the main security office. Help was coming, but the sound of sirens and engines would alert the hostage-takers that their situation had been compromised. Sarah knew that cornered criminals often made desperate choices, and Johnson's life was about to become even more precarious. The next few minutes would determine whether this situation ended with a successful rescue or became a tragedy that would haunt everyone involved. Sarah had to find a way to help without making things worse, but her window of opportunity was closing fast. The sound of approaching security vehicles sent the men inside the depot into a panic. Sarah could hear urgent shouting and the sound of equipment being thrown around as they realized their plan had been discovered. Reynolds's voice rose above the others, screaming orders and threats as their carefully planned operation began to collapse around them. Through the door crack, Sarah watched as the two civilians grabbed their bags and weapons, clearly preparing to fight their way out or use Johnson as a shield. The tall accomplice was speaking rapidly into his phone, possibly calling for extraction or warning other members of their team. The muscular man had taken position near a window, weapon ready, scanning for approaching security forces. Reynolds had dragged Johnson upright, pressing the gun harder against his head while positioning himself where he could see the main entrance. Johnson's face was swollen and bloody, but his eyes remained alert. Despite his injuries and terror, he was looking for any opportunity to escape or fight back. Sarah knew that the arrival of security forces would likely trigger a violent confrontation. The conspirators were trapped and desperate, which made them extremely dangerous. Standard hostage negotiation procedures would take time that Johnson didn't have. These men had already committed serious crimes and had nothing to lose by adding murder to their list. As the first security vehicle came into view, Sarah made a decision that went against all her training. Instead of waiting for the tactical team to establish a perimeter and begin negotiations, she decided to create a distraction that might give Johnson a chance to escape or at least draw attention away from him. She found a loose piece of metal debris near the building and threw it at a window on the opposite side of the depot from where she was positioned. The crash of breaking glass caused immediate chaos inside. The conspirators spun toward the sound, momentarily taking their attention off Johnson and the main entrance. In that brief moment of confusion, Johnson managed to roll away from Reynolds, still tied to the chair but no longer directly in the line of fire. The movement gave him a few precious seconds of distance from the captain's weapon. Sarah heard him shouting for help, his voice carrying across the base and alerting the security teams to his exact location. The distraction worked, but it also revealed Sarah's presence to the conspirators. The muscular accomplice spotted her through the broken window and opened fire. Bullets shattered more glass and splintered the wooden frame as Sarah dove for cover behind a concrete barrier. She was now pinned down and unable to help further, without exposing herself to deadly gunfire. Security forces had surrounded the building, but they couldn't move in without risking Johnson's life. Sarah could hear the incident commander establishing communication protocols and trying to make contact with Reynolds. The captain's response was incoherent shouting mixed with demands for safe passage off the base. The standoff had officially begun, but unlike textbook scenarios, this situation was complicated by the presence of multiple armed conspirators and a hostage who was already injured. The normal rules of engagement didn't account for the desperation Sarah could hear in Reynolds' voice, or the professional determination of his civilian accomplices. As minutes passed, Sarah realized that traditional negotiation tactics might not work. Reynolds seemed to be having some kind of mental breakdown, while his partners were clearly experienced criminals who understood that their only options were escape or elimination of witnesses. The combination created a volatile situation that could explode into violence at any moment. From her position behind cover, Sarah could see members of the base's tactical response team moving into position around the depot. They were professional and well-trained, but they were also following protocols designed for different types of situations. What they needed was someone who could end this quickly and decisively, before desperation drove the conspirators to murder. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Tank Rodriguez had been conducting training exercises with his SEAL team when the emergency call came through. At 35, Tank was a veteran of multiple combat deployments, who had earned his nickname not just for his impressive physical size, but for his ability to power through seemingly impossible situations. His weathered face and calm demeanor reflected years of experience in the world's most dangerous places. Tank and his team were immediately diverted from their training to assist with the hostage situation. As they approached the depot area, Tank quickly assessed the tactical situation. He could see security forces positioned around the building, but their body language told him they were dealing with something beyond their normal experience. The incident commander briefed Tank on what they knew about the situation inside. 3 armed men, including a rogue Navy captain, were holding Petty Officer Johnson hostage while attempting to steal classified materials. Negotiations had failed, and intelligence suggested the conspirators were preparing to execute their hostage and fight their way out. Tank studied the building layout and listened to radio communications from inside. The panic in Reynolds' voice and the professional calm of his civilian accomplices told Tank everything he needed to know about the dynamics of the situation. This wasn't a crime of passion or a simple robbery gone wrong. This was a coordinated intelligence operation that had been compromised, and the participants would do anything to avoid capture. What concerned Tank most was the deteriorating mental state of Captain Reynolds. Unstable individuals in hostage situations were unpredictable and dangerous. They might kill their hostages for no logical reason, or make irrational decisions that endangered everyone involved. The combination of a mentally unstable military officer and professional criminals created a perfect storm of danger. Tank positioned his team strategically around the depot, using their advanced training to identify potential entry points and escape routes. Unlike the regular security forces, the SEALs were equipped and trained for precisely this type of high-risk rescue operation. They could move quickly and decisively to neutralize threats while minimizing risk to the hostage. Through his scope, Tank could see inside the depot where Johnson lay tied and injured on the floor. Reynolds paced back and forth, weapon in hand, occasionally pointing it at Johnson while screaming incoherently. The 2 civilian accomplices had taken defensive positions and were clearly prepared for a firefight. Tank knew that time was running out. Intelligence intercepts suggested that the conspirators had additional support outside the base who might attempt a rescue operation or create diversions elsewhere. Every minute that passed increased the risk that this situation would spiral into something much larger and more dangerous. The SEAL team leader made the decision to act. Standard hostage negotiation protocols were designed for different types of situations, and Tank's experience told him that this particular combination of factors would likely result in the hostage's death if they waited much longer. He had seen similar situations in combat zones, and he knew that decisive action was often the only way to save innocent lives. Tank began coordinating with his team members, using hand signals to communicate their plan. They would need to move simultaneously from multiple entry points to prevent the conspirators from having time to kill Johnson or escape with the classified materials they had stolen. The operation would require split-second timing and absolute precision. As Tank prepared to give the signal to begin their assault, he noticed that Lieutenant Martinez was still pinned down behind cover near one of the windows. Her earlier actions had likely saved Johnson's life by creating the distraction that allowed him to move away from Reynolds' weapon. Tank realized that she might be able to provide valuable assistance if coordinated properly. The pieces were falling into place for a rescue operation, but Tank knew that even with perfect planning and execution, situations like this could go wrong in a heartbeat. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, or one unexpected action by the hostage-takers could turn a successful rescue into a tragedy that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. Tank quickly moved to Sarah's position behind the concrete barrier. Despite the dangerous situation, he remained calm and focused as he explained his plan. The SEALs would create multiple diversions while entering from different points, but they needed someone to maintain visual contact with the hostage during the confusion. Sarah's position gave her the best view of Johnson's location. "When I give the signal, I need you to keep eyes on Johnson and call out his position," Tank whispered. "These guys are going to panic when we move, and we need to know exactly where he is every second." Sarah nodded, understanding the critical role she would play in the rescue operation. Her heart pounded as she realized that Johnson's life might depend on her ability to stay calm and provide accurate information during what would undoubtedly be a chaotic and terrifying few minutes. Tank moved back to coordinate with his team. Through her scope position, Sarah could see that the situation inside was getting worse. Reynolds had stopped pacing and was now kneeling next to Johnson with the gun pressed against his head. The captain was shouting demands for safe passage, but his words were becoming increasingly incoherent. The two civilian accomplices were arguing with Reynolds, clearly frustrated with his deteriorating mental state. They had come here for classified materials, not to participate in a murder-suicide. But they were trapped by circumstances and Reynolds' unpredictable behavior. Their professional criminal instincts told them to cut their losses, but they couldn't abandon their mission without facing consequences from whoever had hired them. Sarah watched as the tall accomplice made a phone call, speaking urgently in what sounded like a foreign language. The conversation was brief and intense, ending with him throwing the phone against the wall in apparent frustration. Whatever support they had been expecting was not coming, and their extraction plan had fallen apart. The muscular accomplice had positioned himself near the main entrance, weapon ready, scanning for any sign of approaching tactical teams. His military-style movement suggested he had combat experience, making him potentially the most dangerous of the three conspirators. Unlike Reynolds, who was operating on emotion and desperation, this man was calculating and professional. Tank's voice came through Sarah's earpiece, calm and steady, despite the tension of the moment. 30 seconds, he said simply. Sarah took a deep breath and focused on Johnson's position, ready to provide the information that could save his life. Inside the depot, Reynolds seemed to reach some kind of decision. He stood up, grabbed Johnson by his shirt, and began dragging him toward what appeared to be a back entrance. The movement put Johnson in an even more vulnerable position, and Sarah could see that the captain's finger was tight on the trigger of his weapon. They're moving toward the rear exit, Sarah reported quietly into her radio. Johnson is being used as a shield. Reynolds appears to be attempting to escape. The situation was evolving rapidly, and Tank had to adjust his plan accordingly. The SEALs couldn't risk a direct assault if Reynolds was using Johnson as a human shield in an escape attempt. They needed to find a way to separate the hostage from his captors without triggering a violent response. As Reynolds dragged Johnson toward the back of the building, the two civilian accomplices began gathering their stolen materials and weapons. They were clearly preparing to follow Reynolds in his escape attempt, but their body language suggested they weren't entirely committed to his plan. The professional criminals understood that using a hostage to escape from a military base was essentially suicide. Sarah realized that the conspirators were about to make their move, and once they got Johnson outside the building, the rescue would become much more complicated. Tank and his team had only moments to act before the situation moved beyond their control and into an even more dangerous phase. Tank made his decision in that split second when Reynolds began moving toward the rear exit with Johnson. The SEAL team leader knew that once the hostage situation moved outside the building, it would become exponentially more dangerous and difficult to resolve. This was their moment to act, and hesitation would likely cost Johnson his life. Execute, Tank commanded through his radio. The coordinated assault began with precision that only came from years of intensive training and combat experience. Two of Tank's team members simultaneously breached the side windows using specialized equipment, while Tank himself moved through the rear entrance that Reynolds was approaching. Sarah watched as the professionals moved like shadows, appearing in multiple locations at once. The effect on the conspirators was immediate and overwhelming. The two civilian accomplices, despite their apparent military backgrounds, were not prepared for the speed and coordination of a SEAL team assault. Before they could react effectively, they found themselves facing highly trained operators who had appeared from directions they hadn't anticipated. Reynolds, in his panicked state, made the fatal mistake of turning toward the commotion instead of focusing on his hostage. In that moment of distraction, Tank appeared behind him like a force of nature. The SEAL's years of combat experience had taught him to move silently and strike decisively when the opportunity presented itself. Tank's approach was textbook perfect. He moved low and fast, using the confusion and Reynolds' momentary distraction to close the distance between them. Reynolds never saw him coming. In one fluid motion, Tank struck Reynolds' weapon hand while simultaneously grabbing Johnson and pulling him away from immediate danger. The gun flew from Reynolds' grasp and clattered across the concrete floor. Johnson, despite his injuries and the trauma of his ordeal, had enough presence of mind to roll away from the struggle and give Tank room to work. The petty officer's military training had prepared him to react correctly, even in the most terrifying circumstances. Reynolds, suddenly faced with Tank's imposing presence and realizing that his weapon was gone, began to panic completely. He swung wildly at the seal, but Tank easily avoided the clumsy attacks while maintaining control of the situation. Within seconds, Reynolds was on the ground, restrained and no longer a threat to anyone. Meanwhile, Tank's team members had successfully neutralized the two civilian accomplices with minimal violence. Their professional training had taught them to react to changing situations, but they were no match for SEALs operating on their home territory with perfect intelligence about the building layout and tactical situation. Sarah emerged from her position as the immediate danger passed, rushing to check on Johnson's condition. Despite his injuries and the trauma he had endured, the petty officer was conscious and alert. His training had helped him survive an ordeal that would have broken many people, and his courage throughout the situation had likely prevented the conspirators from accessing more classified materials. The aftermath moved quickly as medical personnel arrived to treat Johnson's injuries, and investigators began the process of understanding how Captain Reynolds had been recruited or coerced into participating in what was clearly an intelligence operation against the United States. The two civilian accomplices were taken into custody, where they would face questioning about their identities and the organization that had sent them. Tank found Sarah after the immediate crisis had passed. Despite her fear and the danger she had faced, she had performed admirably under pressure. Her quick thinking and willingness to take calculated risks had provided the intelligence and distraction that made the rescue possible. "You did good work today," Tank told her simply. "Johnson's alive because you made the right choices when it mattered." As the investigation continued in the days that followed, it became clear that Reynolds had been struggling with financial problems and personal issues that made him vulnerable to recruitment by foreign intelligence services. The two civilian accomplices were identified as professional operatives who had successfully infiltrated other military installations in the past. Sarah's actions that day earned her commendation and recognition, but more importantly, they had saved a fellow sailor's life and prevented classified materials from falling into enemy hands. The experience taught her that sometimes the most important decisions happen in moments when there's no time to think, only time to act on training and instinct. Johnson made a full recovery from his physical injuries, though the psychological impact of his ordeal would take longer to heal. He never forgot that his survival had depended on the courage and quick thinking of his fellow sailors, especially Sarah's willingness to risk her own safety to save his life. The depot was secured, the conspirators were in custody, and the base returned to normal operations. But for those who had lived through those terrifying minutes, the memory of how quickly a routine day could turn into a life-or-death situation would stay with them forever.